The blind date had never been Claire's idea. It was Rachel's, and like most of Rachel's ideas, it sounded perfectly reasonable on paper, yet turned into something close to a catastrophe once translated into real life. Still, after half a year of spending every Friday night with nothing but a pint of mint chocolate chip ice cream and a stack of romance novels that only made her feel more hopelessly single, Claire finally nodded in resignation. Rachel had shown her a picture and said his name was Daniel, looking as though he had stepped straight out of a GQ magazine cover with his dark blonde hair, ice blue eyes, and the kind of jawline that had surely earned its share of whispered compliments in corporate conference rooms. He had even specified that he wanted to meet someone who loved reading, and Rachel had delivered that line with a tone suggesting it should have been enough to sweep Claire off her feet. And so Claire found herself standing outside an upscale bar in Chicago's River North neighborhood, a place so sophisticated that one glance at the sign told her the drinks inside would easily exceed her budget. She wore the dress Rachel swore would make her legs look longer and her curves appear fuller, clutching her grandmother's vintage purse as though it were a lifeline in the middle of a shipwreck. Claire was 15 minutes late. Her glasses kept fogging with every breath in the early winter chill, and the neatly pinned bun she had wrestled with for over an hour was already beginning to unravel. In short, she was a walking disaster, fighting to maintain the last bit of dignity she had left. But she had shown up, and that had to count for something. She told herself this as she drew a long breath, adjusted her dress straps, smoothed a few stubborn strands of hair, and stared at the bar's fogged glass door glowing with warm, promising golden light. This was the meeting with the man she had spent all week imagining, the man Rachel insisted was perfect for her in every way. Claire had rehearsed opening lines, practiced how to smile without looking forced, tried to remember how not to reveal that she hadn't felt a real spark in what felt like ages. She had prepared for this evening with meticulous plans, neatly arranged expectations, and carefully controlled assumptions. What she did not know was that in exactly 5 minutes every bit of that preparation would crumble the moment she stepped inside and accidentally kissed the wrong man. A man she was never meant to meet. A man who had absolutely nothing to do with this blind date, yet the very one who would pull her life into an orbit she had never dared imagine. And that mistake would change everything. Before we continue with Claire's wrong kiss love story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like and share this video so that surprising and touching stories like this can reach more people every day. Tell us where you are watching from. Leave a comment about the city or country you are in, so we can see the places around the world that this storytelling journey has managed to touch, and know that we are always waiting to read every single line you share. Claire stepped into the bar with a steadiness she did not truly feel. The light inside soft yet sophisticated as it swept across the row of dark leather seats, and the flicker of warm golden candles glinting on marble tabletops, making her feel as though she had wandered into a scene from a high-end romantic film in which she was not entirely certain she had earned the leading role. The scent of strong liquor mingling with wood and expensive perfume drifted through the air, reminding her how out of place she was in a borrowed dress and a pair of heels doing their best to hide a small scratch along the back. But she had not come here to feel comfortable. She had come to begin something, or at least pretend she was ready to. Rachel had said that Daniel would be sitting at the bar, wearing a dark suit and carrying a book, because he believed bringing a book to a first date would make a lasting impression on someone who loved literature. Claire scanned the room, her heart beginning to thump with a mix of anticipation and confusion, and then she saw him. A man at the far end of the bar, his back to her, tall with broad shoulders wrapped in an elegant black suit, one hand holding a glass of amber liquor while the other rested lightly on a thick book beside it. Claire narrowed her eyes at the cover, unable to read it clearly, but the size and shade made her guess it was a refined edition of The Count of Monte Cristo, just as Rachel had mentioned. His hair was a deep blonde that bordered on light brown beneath the lights, slightly wavy at the nape. She could not see his face, but even the faint angle of his profile was enough to make her heart misstep. This had to be Daniel. She straightened her dress, drew another deep breath, and walked toward him, her heels tapping softly across the polished wood floor. When she was less than a meter away, she stopped thinking altogether. Rachel's last text message flashed in her mind like a command. He hates awkward intros. Don't ask if it's him. Just walk up and kiss him. Trust me. He specifically asked for a woman who takes charge. It was insane advice, the kind Claire would usually scoff at, but in her nervousness, it felt like the only instruction she could cling to. Before he could turn or speak, Claire touched the back of his chair, stepped to his side, and leaned in, pressing a kiss to his lips. A real kiss, not a clumsy greeting, but a brief moment filled with intention, trembling slightly but not lacking confidence. She felt the warm whiskey on his breath, the firm yet soft shape of his mouth, and the flicker of surprise when his hand paused at the edge of the counter. And then the impossible happened. He did not push her away. He did not pull back, did not ask who she was, did not say a single word. Instead, his hand rose and slipped behind her neck, gentle but unyielding, as though steadying something unexpected that had just fallen into his arms. And then he kissed her back. Not with impulsive abandon, but with the sort of kiss that made the world around them dim, leaving only the two of them and the spark of something igniting in the space between. Claire nearly forgot who she was, why she was here, even the name of the man she had come to meet. When the kiss ended, her breath stuttered and her mind reeled. She opened her eyes, stepped back half a pace, and looked into his, and in a long, breathless instant, she understood something was terribly wrong. The man before her had storm-gray eyes as cold as early morning fog, sun-touched skin, and a face so sharply cut it might have been carved from marble. He was not Daniel. He could not be. She stepped back again, her lips parted, her whole body flushing with embarrassment and alarm, while the stranger in front of her watched her intently, as though studying every flicker of expression moving across her face. And then he tilted his head slightly, the corner of his mouth lifting. It was not a smile. It was something far more dangerous, a spark of interest. Claire stood frozen where she was, her breath unsteady, and her face flushed, not because of the kiss but because of the shock that had crashed through her like a cold wave. She had kissed the wrong man, not Daniel, not the carefully arranged blind date Rachel had treated like a reward for Claire's persistence in being single, not the man with the pleasant blue eyes, pre-programmed love of books, and stable financial life. This man was entirely different. His gaze was as sharp as a blade, storm-dark and unsettling, his face strikingly beautiful in a way that felt almost dangerous. Claire stepped back, her fingers tightening around the strap of her purse as though it were the last piece of reality she could cling to. She opened her mouth, ready to say something, anything, an apology, an explanation, a desperate attempt to salvage the dignity currently plummeting without a parachute, but she never got the chance. He tilted his head, those gray eyes seeming to burrow into her, and then he spoke. He did not ask who she was. He did not ask why she had done it. He did not sound irritated or offended. He simply asked, in a low, foreign-tinged voice that brushed past her ear like a deliberate whisper, whether she was certain she had kissed the wrong man. Claire blinked, unable to react. She tried to speak, to explain that this was a misunderstanding, a foolish mistake, a social catastrophe of the highest order, but he was already rising from his seat, perfectly calm, lifting his glass in his hand and never once letting his gaze leave her. She realized he was looking at her the way no one had ever looked at her before, as though she were a difficult question, a compelling secret, a reckless intruder who had stepped into his world by mistake. When she finally managed to speak, her voice rasped with embarrassment. She told him she was sorry, that she had mistaken him for someone else, that she was waiting for a date named Daniel, and that he had. She glanced toward the book beside his drink, said he would bring a copy of The Count of Monte Cristo. He looked down at the book and let the corner of his mouth lift. "This is Crime and Punishment," he said. "Russian, not French, not even close." Claire wished the floor would open beneath her feet. She tried again, stumbling over her words, saying she did not know why she had done it, that she had only seen, then stopped, apologizing once more and saying she would leave. But before she could turn away, his hand reached out and closed gently around her wrist. Not tight, not forceful, just firm enough to stop her and guide her back toward him. He told her she had arrived late, and the man she was supposed to meet had not waited, but she had kissed a stranger instead. And that, he said, pausing as his eyes studied every shift in her expression, was rather interesting. Claire swallowed hard, her heartbeat pounding against her ribs. She managed to ask who he was. "Julian," he said. "Julian Moreau." The name slipped from his lips like an invitation. Claire nodded faintly, scarcely breathing as she told him her name. "Claire Bennett." Julian repeated it, as though tasting the sound of it, then released her wrist and gestured toward the empty seat beside him. If she had caused an incident, he said, then she should at least sit and explain it properly. Or she could run, but she would always wonder what she had walked away from. She looked at him, then around the bar. No one seemed to be paying attention. The moment had been soft enough not to draw notice. She knew she should leave, but her legs refused to move. And then, as though someone else were steering her body, Claire slowly sat down. Julian lifted his glass toward the bartender, signaling for 2 more drinks. He said he believed he had just experienced the most intriguing first kiss of his life, and that he had never been one to believe in accidents. Claire looked at him, unable to tell whether she had stumbled into trouble or something far more dangerous than a simple mistake. But his eyes never left her, and in that moment she felt that if she continued down this path, nothing in her life would ever return to the way it had been. Claire eased herself into the chair with the caution of someone who knew she had stepped into a game whose rules she did not fully understand. Julian continued to watch her, his gaze never leaving her face for even a moment, as though he were reading each faint signal, each fleeting expression. He lifted his glass, took a small sip, and set it down with the quiet confidence of a man who seemed to shape the atmosphere around him with nothing more than his presence. Claire had no idea where to begin. How did one speak to a stranger she had accidentally kissed the moment they met, and now found herself sitting beside, sharing drinks only minutes later? She did not do things like this. Never. She finally spoke, saying she did not think she had ever kissed a man she did not know before learning his name, trying to keep her voice steady despite the slight tremor at the end. Julian tilted his head, a suggestion of a smile forming at the corner of his mouth. Then he said he was honored to be the first. He added that he, too, did not usually kiss women who opened an evening by claiming his personal space. He used that phrase without a hint of irritation, instead layering it with a quiet, dark humor that made Claire laugh despite herself. She pushed her glasses up, trying to recover a sense of composure. She asked whether he had come alone. Julian nodded, his hands clasping loosely in front of him, his thumbs circling the silver ring on his index finger in an unconscious motion. He said he had come to enjoy a bit of quiet, to read, to drink. It appeared fate had other intentions. Claire glanced at the book on the table, Crime and Punishment. She turned the cover lightly. Russian, he nodded, his mother tongue. He did not elaborate further. Claire was surprised, but did not press. She realized he chose his answers carefully, not evasively, but with the measured discernment of someone who understood exactly how much of himself he wished to reveal. He was not showy, but he was certainly not ordinary. She asked whether he was Russian. Julian gave a small shake of his head and said he had grown up in many places, France, Russia, then America, when he was still quite young, but Chicago was where he had chosen to stay. He said he liked the city because it had enough light for people to feel safe and enough shadows for no one to become too curious. The words stopped Claire for a moment. There was something gently ominous in the way he phrased it, like a warning wrapped in the softness of literature. She was not entirely sure he was the kind of man she should be sitting beside, yet she did not want to leave. She asked what he did for a living. Julian smiled and lifted his glass slightly, as though weighing his reply. He said he was in business, import and distribution. It sounded vague, meaning everything and nothing at once, but Claire did not push further. He had the air of someone who disliked being interrogated yet inspired no fear. If anything, he stirred a quiet, irresistible curiosity in her. Like a book without a title she felt compelled to open, just to see what the first chapter held. Then Julian asked about her, his gaze softening. Claire told him she was an editor, working at an independent publishing house. She said classical literature was the great love of her life, though lately she had been reading far too many terrible manuscripts about couples who fell in love in 3 days and married on the edge of a volcano or something equally dramatic. Julian laughed. A small, warm sound, and Claire found herself laughing with him. For the next few minutes, they talked about books, about characters they cherished, about Claire's dream of someday opening a tiny bookstore with old wooden shelves and a coffee counter tucked into the corner. Julian listened with a stillness that felt rare, never interrupting, never checking his phone, never displaying even a shadow of boredom. He looked at her as if she were the only thing in the room worth paying attention to, and that was what Claire could not pull herself away from. Not his looks, nor the quiet gravitas in his voice, but the way he made her feel seen, as though she were not the stranger who had ruined someone's evening, but someone invited to stay just a little longer. And the most surprising part for Claire was that she wanted to stay. When the second glass of wine was set down in front of her, Claire glanced at Julian with a flicker of hesitation, but his eyes remained calm, steady, waiting without pressing her, without asking for anything. The warm golden light behind him made the gray in his eyes deepen into something like a still night lake without a single ripple. Claire lifted the glass and took a small sip, the sharp burn spreading across her tongue and slipping down her throat, carrying with it something warmer than the liquor itself. The initial awkwardness melted away like the first snow of early spring. She no longer felt the need to brace herself, no need to perform or prove she was interesting. She could simply be herself, and with him, that seemed to be enough. Their conversation flowed so effortlessly that when she glanced at the clock for the first time after a long stretch of laughter, she could hardly believe more than an hour had passed. Julian had a way of speaking that made the real world fade. He told her stories of uncertain truth about ancient cities, about men reading philosophy in dining rooms and women in silk dresses dancing in wine cellars. When Claire asked how many countries he had visited, he only smiled, took another sip of wine, and answered with a kind of deliberate vagueness that allowed her imagination to wander without giving her anything definite to grasp. His stories felt incomplete, like fragments of poetry, but still somehow mesmerizing. When she told him about her college years, about the old bookstore where she worked part-time, and the first night she read Jane Eyre under the glow of a small desk lamp in the middle of a winter night, Julian did not interrupt, did not rush to respond. He simply watched her as though he were storing away every word. Claire felt not only heard but seen, understood in a way few people had ever made her feel. The background noise around them softened into a gentle blur, the faint clink of spoons against glasses, distant laughter, the low hum of jazz drifting like the slow, steady breath of the room itself. Claire spoke about her parents, about her mother, a woman so strong she was almost intimidating, and her father, quiet but unwavering in his support. Julian nodded as if he understood the feeling, then said gently that he had never had a family quite like that his memories were a string of constant movement between cities, hotel apartments, faces never lingering long enough to remember their names. Claire hesitated, unsure whether to ask more, sensing something in his voice that was not sadness but a kind of solitude, a well-contained emptiness, revealed only because he allowed it. Then they talked about films, about scenes they loved, about characters who stayed with them long after the story ended. Claire was amazed when Julian quoted a line from a classic French film and even pronounced perfectly a phrase in Italian she could not understand but felt resonate through her. She laughed, realizing he was unlike any man she had ever known. Julian never asked about Daniel. He never mentioned the mistaken kiss. In his world, it seemed everything happened for a reason, and coincidence was merely fate wearing a disguise. When the server asked if they wanted anything else, Claire startled to realize it was already close to 11 in the evening. She looked at Julian, expecting him to suggest ending the night, but he only looked back at her, his expression unhurried. "If you are not tired, we can stay a little longer," he said. The simple words made her smile. She nodded. Neither of them wanted to stand up. Neither of them wanted this to end. Because something, though still unnamed, had begun, and they both felt it, even if neither dared to say it aloud. As they stepped out of the bar, Claire felt as though she were walking through a dream lit by street lamps and the lingering warmth of wine on her tongue. The Chicago night air was cool, but not cool enough to make her pull her hand away from the warm one holding hers. Julian said little once they left, only asking quietly whether she wanted to go home or let the night stretch a little longer. Claire had been silent for a few seconds before she nodded. Perhaps it was the wine, perhaps the shimmering atmosphere suspended between them, or perhaps it was something deeper that she dared not name. But she nodded. They walked along the stone sidewalk, the rhythm of her heels pacing beside the steady steps of his. He did not lead her to a parked car, but instead called for a private one. The driver opened the door without needing a word from Julian, greeting him with a short nod and a professional glance. Claire noticed this, but said nothing, stepping into the car where the smooth leather seats and the faint trace of Julian's cologne made the space feel as though it had narrowed into a world meant only for the two of them. When she asked where he lived, he smiled and answered simply, "In a building near Lake Michigan." When the car turned down, a quiet street lined with winter trees stripped of their leaves, she saw a large glass-fronted building, glowing softly against the night, elegant without announcing itself. A private elevator carried them to the top floor, silent and without music or numbered buttons, as though the place existed only for people who never needed directions. When the door opened, Claire held her breath. The apartment unfolded before her like something from the pages of an interior design magazine, every detail chosen with meticulous intention. Dark wood floors, high ceilings, modern minimalist furniture that exuded an understated luxury, and an immense wall of glass, revealing the sweeping night view of Chicago. Below them, the lights formed silver and gold ribbons weaving through the movement of cars, the buildings rising and falling like silhouettes in an ocean of illumination. Claire walked toward the window, placing her hand lightly against the cool glass, unable to take her eyes off the magnificent scene. She could not believe she was here, in a place like this, with a man who had been a stranger only hours earlier. Julian came to stand behind her, not too close, just near enough that his breath faintly clouded the glass beside hers. He asked if she wanted something to drink: wine, tea, or simply water. Claire turned, shook her head, still unsure what to say. He poured himself a glass of wine with an easy, deliberate grace, then handed her a light throw blanket. Claire settled onto the long velvet sofa, letting herself sink into its softness, silent for a lingering moment. Julian sat across from her, set his glass on the glass-topped table, and watched her in a way that made her feel he was waiting for her to form the questions she had not yet asked. But strangely, she did not want to ask anything. She just wanted to remain in this moment, where everything felt unusually quiet and unexpectedly safe. He put on a piece of instrumental music, soft piano notes that drifted gently through the room like a calm exhale. Claire drew her legs onto the sofa, wrapping her arms around her knees, her eyes still fixed on the view outside. She asked whether he lived alone. Julian nodded. For some time now, he said. He did not elaborate, and she did not ask. In that moment, she realized something quietly lonely beneath the refined, powerful exterior he carried so effortlessly. She did not know what had brought her here, what had carried her from a simple blind date to the threshold of a man like Julian Moreau. But right now, as the city breathed below them, Claire understood one thing with stunning clarity. She had never stood anywhere that made her feel so small and so deeply seen at the same time, and she had never wanted to leave a place so little. The first light of morning slipped through the thin ivory curtains, casting faint streaks across the ceiling and making Claire blink several times before full awareness returned, the familiar scent lingering on the throw blanket around her. A faint trace of cedarwood and strong liquor told her immediately that she was not at home. She was lying on the long, dark sofa in the penthouse from the night before, still wrapped in the thin blanket Julian had given her, while they sat in quiet companionship watching the city sink into sleep. She remembered how exhaustion had pulled her under, how she had drifted off without a proper goodbye, without even an apology. At some point, Julian had disappeared, leaving her the space with a kind of restraint that felt almost too thoughtful. Claire sat up, pushed her hair back, and stepped onto the cool wooden floor, her vision still hazy but her mind already beginning to register the details around her. Everything remained elegant, immaculate to the point of sterility, but as she walked through the living area in search of a bathroom, a few things began to stand out. The first was the bookshelf at the end of the hallway, a place untouched by the morning light. Every book was bound in black or gray leather, with no titles, no authors' names. They were arranged with such strict precision that when she tilted her head to examine them more closely, she noticed small markings on the spines, symbols that looked almost coded. She reached out as if to pull one free but froze. Struck by the sudden sense that she was about to disturb something she was not meant to see, she stepped away from the shelf and walked a bit farther when she noticed a door left slightly ajar. Inside was a small room devoid of decoration, except for a dark wooden desk, 2 black leather chairs, and an entire wall covered in surveillance screens. Claire held her breath. At least 8 screens displayed live footage from different parts of the building: the basement entrance, the private elevator, multiple hallways, the main lobby, and even the rear balcony. Another screen showed blocks of technical command lines, resembling the kind of high-security system she had only ever seen in films. She stepped back quickly, her heart pounding, her mouth suddenly dry. No normal person needed that kind of surveillance in a private residence. She hurried toward the kitchen for a glass of water, but when she opened the refrigerator, the third detail made her stop cold. Everything inside was unbranded. Every bottle, every container was sealed in identical glass vessels, arranged perfectly by size and color. Nothing haphazard, nothing personal, nothing lived in. It looked curated, not inhabited. When she returned to the living room, Julian was there, leaning casually against the glass frame, wearing a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, a cup of black coffee in his hand. He watched her with the quiet steadiness of someone who had been standing there for a while, observing every movement. "Sleep well?" he asked. Claire nodded, trying to hide the unease rising in her chest. "You really live here alone?" Julian took a sip of his coffee and did not answer immediately. The question hung between them, taut like a wire pulled too tight. Claire studied him, her gaze catching on the expressionless calm of his face, the faint glint of something that looked oddly like caution. She did not know what she had just stumbled into, but she knew one thing with startling clarity. Julian Moreau was not merely a businessman living in a luxurious penthouse in Chicago, and she, somehow, had walked straight into something far larger than anything she imagined when she pressed her lips to a stranger in a dimly lit bar the night before. Julian set his coffee cup on the table and walked slowly toward Claire, his eyes never leaving her for even a second. Claire remained standing in the middle of the wide living room, where the morning light streamed through the pristine glass and made everything too real, too sharply defined for her to keep pretending she had not seen what she had seen. She knew he recognized that, and the knowledge made the silence between them more tense than any question could have been. Julian stopped in front of her, keeping just enough distance to respect her space but not enough to still the pounding in her chest. He looked at her without looking away, then spoke in a low, steady voice, as though he had been preparing for this moment for a very long time. "You saw a few things, didn't you?" Claire nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving him, searching for any sign that he might laugh it off or offer some harmless explanation for the nameless books, the layers of surveillance, and the way this entire penthouse felt like a fortress disguised as a home. But he offered no excuses. Instead, he spoke plainly, without evasion. "I am not only a businessman, Claire. My life is not like most people's." He paused, waiting for her reaction. Claire held his gaze, silent not because she lacked words but because she needed him to continue. Julian drew a quiet breath, his voice as smooth and measured as a classical piece played in an empty room. "I work within a network most people prefer to call a financial conglomerate, but the truth of it is far less polished. Some call it the Mafia, others simply call it power in the shadows. Whatever name you choose, I am part of it." Claire felt suspended between cold and heat, unable to move. His confession was not what shocked her. The way he delivered it with such unflinching calm was what left her unable to decide whether he was confessing or testing her. He was not asking for forgiveness. He was stating a fact. "What about the apartment? The surveillance?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "They are part of staying safe. Not just for me, but for the people I care about." Julian's voice was slow, unguarded, unapologetic. He made no attempt to soften it for her comfort. He was simply giving her a chance to walk away. Claire looked into his gray eyes, seeing no pleading there, but something deeper, almost sorrowful. She turned away for a few steps, looking out through the window where the city glowed under the rising sun. A part of her wanted to leave immediately, to run out of this building, erase everything that had happened, and return to the old life where things were simple, predictable, unshadowed. But another part of her, the part she did not want to acknowledge, was drawn to the contradiction itself. She turned back to find him still watching her, as though waiting for her to choose the direction of her fate. "I should be afraid of you, shouldn't I?" Julian did not answer at once. Then he gave a small nod. "But I am not." The words surprised even Claire. She said them not to appear brave, but because she truly felt no fear. Confusion, yes, but fear, no. Because in the man standing before her with his cold edges, dangerous poise, and quiet gravity she saw an undeniable truth. He was trying to protect her, even if in a way foreign to anything she had ever known. Julian watched her for a long moment before stepping closer, his hands not reaching for her, merely standing near enough that she could feel the beat of his heart. "You can still leave. The door is right there. No one is keeping you here." Claire took a long, steady breath, then shook her head. "Not yet. Not until I understand who you are." Julian closed his eyes briefly, as if exhaling both relief and the weight of a beginning he had never expected. And from that moment, Claire knew her life had stepped into a path with no return. Yet strangely, she felt no regret. 3 days after the morning Julian had confessed everything, Claire sat in the back of his car, the fogged window reflecting streaks of streetlight sliding past like fragments of a dream. She did not ask where he was taking her. She simply watched the city drift by, her hands resting loosely in her lap, a quiet tremor of anticipation humming beneath her skin. Julian had said one thing before the car began to move, that if she wanted to understand him, she needed to see his world with her own eyes. And now she was on her way there. The car turned into a narrow alley tucked between 2 old buildings and stopped before a large metal door with no sign, no lights, nothing to suggest anything meaningful lay behind it. Julian stepped out first and knocked 3 times against a patch of weathered brick. The door opened soundlessly, and Claire followed him into a dim hallway lit by muted golden lamps. At the end of the hall was a staircase leading underground, and when they reached the bottom, she felt as though she had stepped into another realm. A hidden restaurant lay beneath the city, where raw brick walls were warmed by oil lamps. Long wooden tables were dressed in crisp white linen, and the air carried a soft symphony of food and wine. No one was loud. No one questioned who they were. The servers moved with the elegance of stage performers, and when Julian entered, they all greeted him with the subtle nods one reserves for someone familiar, perhaps even someone significant. He did not introduce Claire to anyone. He simply pulled out her chair, ordered dinner in a deep, warm French, and smiled slightly when he saw her surprise. "You wanted to know," he said. "This is where it begins." After a quiet meal layered with unspoken meanings, They left the restaurant through a different corridor, walking down a long passage that led to a small elevator. When the doors opened, Claire expected them to descend even further, but instead they rose to the top floor of a building across the street. The elevator opened into a spacious room, bathed in the soft gold of Italian pendant lights, where the hand-painted ceiling arched high above them and walls were lined with large framed canvases. A private gallery, but without visitors, without staff, without any sign of public existence. The paintings were raw and deeply emotional, bold strokes that stripped away whatever pain had once been hidden. Claire moved slowly from frame to frame, asking nothing, needing no explanations. Julian remained behind her, letting her wander through whatever the art stirred in her. When she turned to look at him, her eyes still filled with the echo of the images, he simply told her that this gallery was not open to the public, that it existed only to keep the things that could never be sold. From the gallery, they walked to a small corner street, where Julian unlocked the door of an old bookstore with a weathered wooden sign. Claire had not known such a place could still exist in the center of the city. There was no bell chiming at the door, no neon lights, only the scent of old paper, aging wood, and the gentle ticking of a wall clock. The shelves rose to the ceiling, packed with antique books, many bound in leather, some handwritten, some bearing ink marks faded from centuries before. Claire ran her fingers along the spines, feeling as though she were walking through someone's memory. She stopped when she found a volume of Russian poetry, its gold lettering worn nearly away, and when she turned, she saw Julian standing at the counter, preparing tea in an old silver kettle. "You once asked why I read Crime and Punishment," he said. Claire nodded softly. "Because, in my world," he answered, "sometimes literature is the only thing that keeps us human." She had no response. Every place he had taken her, every quiet fragment of his life he had revealed, carried a strange contradiction. Outwardly powerful, hidden, guarded, but within soft, reflective, heartbreakingly beautiful. When they stepped out of the shop, the night had grown late, the streets hushed and empty. Julian did not ask what she thought, nor did he try to explain himself. He simply reached for her hand, and in that touch, Claire felt she had crossed into a world no map could guide her through, a world navigated only by instinct, emotion, and a fragile belief that sometimes getting lost was the only way to find what mattered most. Claire arrived at Julian's home on a cloudy Saturday afternoon, the wind sweeping in from Lake Michigan carrying a damp chill that made one long for someplace warm to rest. Julian greeted her with a soft smile and an invitation to stay for dinner. But instead of the familiar quiet of his penthouse, Claire noticed the dining table had been set for an extra guest. She barely had time to ask when the elevator chimed and a woman stepped out, tall, poised, her dark hair falling neatly to her shoulders, her eyes sharp in the way of someone who had seen far more than most should. Julian introduced her as Elise, his sister. Elise leaned in to kiss Julian's cheek, then turned to Claire and extended her hand with a grace that carried no excess warmth. "It is very nice to meet you. I have heard a great deal about you." Claire smiled, shook her hand, and in that brief moment felt something unspoken pass between them. Dinner took place in the smaller dining room, where the soft gold light brushed against gray stone walls, creating an atmosphere both elegant and strangely performative. Julian kept the conversation light, but Claire sensed Elise studying her not openly, but with a quiet precision impossible to ignore. After dessert, Julian excused himself to take a call. Elise poured Claire more tea, her movements smooth and polite, but when Julian's footsteps had faded, she finally looked directly at Claire, and her gaze was no longer that of a sister visiting her brother, but of someone who had lived through losses deeper than her years should allow. "Do you know what you are walking into?" Claire kept her voice steady. "Your brother told me enough so that I am not walking in blind." Elise nodded slightly, set her cup down, and continued watching her. "My brother is a good man, good in his own way, but the world he belongs to is not. In that world, everything has conditions, even affection." Claire swallowed. Elise tilted her head, speaking slowly. "I have seen women like you before arriving with trusting eyes and innocent hearts, but love does not last long in this world. It is traded, manipulated, corrupted. People will target you not for who you are, but because you are the one person he cares about." There was no threat in Elise's words, but each one settled heavily, thickening the air around them. "My brother can protect you, but when the time comes for him to choose between the woman he loves and the life of someone else, sometimes he will not choose the way you think." Claire sat still, fighting to keep her breath even. She did not know how much to believe, but she could tell Elise was not trying to frighten her. She was offering a warning born of experience. When Julian returned, Elise smiled again as though nothing tense had passed between them. She excused herself, citing an unexpected obligation, and just before stepping into the elevator, she paused beside Claire and whispered a final line only the two of them could hear. "If you are strong enough, stay. But if you doubt even for a second, leave while you still can." Claire remained standing long after Elise had gone, her tea cooling in her hands unnoticed. Julian wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin gently on her shoulder, his warmth coaxing her toward the idea of safety. But Elise's words echoed in her mind like a refrain. Love does not last long in this world. And for the first time, Claire wondered whether she truly understood the path she had begun to follow. It began with a plain white envelope slipped beneath Claire's apartment door on a Monday morning, just as she returned from a short work trip with the publishing house. She thought it was advertising mail, but inside was a single sheet of paper, stark and unadorned, holding only 7 words typed on an old typewriter with no punctuation. "He is not the man you think." No signature, no return address, no traceable mark of any kind. Claire stood frozen in the entryway, a cold dread settling through her. She kept it to herself, telling Julian nothing. But 3 days later, when she opened her mailbox at the office, she found a second envelope. Inside was a black and white photograph, high quality, taken from a hidden vantage point. In the picture, Claire was sitting with Julian at the small cafe near the antique bookstore, their posture intimate, Julian's gaze turned slightly toward her. The photo had been taken from behind a pane of glass, perhaps from a car window or through a telephoto lens. She remembered that day they had only sat for an hour. Nothing remarkable had happened, but what chilled her was the precision of the angle, as though someone had followed them for blocks, waiting for that exact moment. This time, a faint line of ink appeared along the edge of the photo. "You do not know what he did to keep this life." Claire took the photograph home and hid it inside an old book where no one would find it. From then on, she became more cautious, glancing over her shoulder as she walked, noting cars that lingered too long on her street, unfamiliar faces in the elevator, even baristas who seemed just a little too familiar. But nothing stood out as definitively wrong, no clear threat, no proof, only the growing sense of being watched, tightening around her like a fog that never lifted. The following Saturday night, when Claire returned home after meeting an old friend, she found the third envelope. This time it held a stack of photographs, 12 in all, taken at different times and places. She and Julian leaving the gallery, Claire walking alone outside the bookstore, Julian speaking on the balcony of his penthouse. There was even one of her asleep on his sofa, the window light falling across her face, her hair loose around her shoulders. She had never seen that moment captured, had no memory of Julian taking it, if it had been him at all. The final photograph bore a line scrawled in shaky red ink. "When you learn the truth, there will be no way back." Claire sank to the floor, her pulse thrashing wildly. There was no denying it now. Someone was tracking their every move, every private moment that should have belonged to them alone. She lifted her phone, ready to call Julian, then stopped. Part of her wanted his answers, his reassurance, but another part feared that speaking the words aloud would unravel everything. Elise's voice echoed in her mind. That kind of love does not survive long in this world. Claire sat in silence for hours. The photographs spread around her like wordless evidence of something she was not yet brave enough to face. She did not know who had sent them, did not know their motive, did not know what game she had stepped into. But for the first time since the night she kissed the wrong stranger, Claire felt she was standing on the thin boundary between trust and danger, and one wrong step could bring everything crashing down before she had a chance to understand any of it. Julian came to Claire the very night she sent him the photographs someone had secretly taken of them, his eyes darkening not with surprise but with a contained heaviness, as though he had long expected this moment to arrive. He did not ask why she had waited so long to tell him, nor did he reproach her for keeping it from him. He only said, in a slow and measured voice, that she could not spend another night in her old apartment. Claire sat quietly in his car through the short drive, the silence so deep she could hear nothing but the sound of the tires pressing through the damp pavement after the rain. She did not ask where they were going, because something in Julian's expression, resolute, colder than she had ever seen it, made her feel as if he had just abandoned the last mask of gentleness he had worn. When the car stopped, Claire found herself standing before a 3-story building tucked into a quiet residential pocket in the northern part of the city, with no visible address, no open windows, no light spilling from within. Julian called it a safe house, a place known only to 3 people in his network, and now she was the 4th. The house was designed like a fortress, thick steel doors, a separate camera grid, an interior stripped down to bare essentials, devoid of anything resembling daily life. No books, no artwork, no music, only silence. And the disquieting feeling of being cut off from the world, as if she had stepped into a blank space on a map. Claire entered the room prepared for her, neat and clean but lifeless. She sat on the edge of the bed, her eyes drifting over the room as though searching for a memory to anchor herself to. Julian handed her a new phone, encrypted, telling her this was the only device she should use from now on. She asked about her job, her friends, the publishing house, but he only shook his head. She had to disappear for a while, at least until they learned who was watching and why. Claire tried to nod, tried to understand that this was for her protection, that he was doing the right thing. But inside her, a quiet unease seeped through like cold water slipping into stone. She was not used to living in a place where every movement might be recorded, where no door opened without a code, where no one knew where she was and no one was allowed to know. She woke in the middle of the night to the faintest sound in the hallway, her heart pounding, her palms damp. But when she opened the door, only a small camera blinked back at her. No one else was there. The days that followed passed slowly and heavily, and Claire began to lose her sense of time. Julian appeared only a few hours each day, saying little, never allowing her to probe too deeply. She gradually felt not only hidden, but removed from the world entirely. She no longer chose where to go, whom to see, or what to do. Everything was decided for her in the name of safety. And what unsettled her most was that Julian no longer resembled the Julian she had known at the beginning. His eyes had grown deeper, his voice shorter, the tenderness that once surrounded him now replaced by a deliberate distance. Claire sat alone in her room at night, staring at the cold gray walls, realizing with a quiet ache that she no longer knew whether she was being protected or confined. No emails, no messages from Rachel, no check-in calls from her mother. Every trace of her old life had been cut away, and when Claire looked at her reflection, she saw a version of herself she no longer recognized. A woman living in the shadows of a world she had never chosen to enter, but now found herself unable to leave. Claire could not pinpoint exactly what broke open inside her that afternoon. Perhaps it was the too loud ticking of the clock in the long silence, or the narrow shaft of sunlight cutting through the small ceiling window that made her realize she had not seen the outside world for nearly a week. Or maybe it was the dream from the night before, in which she saw herself trapped inside a glass box, watching people walk past while no one heard her call. When Julian entered the living room as he always did, setting a cup of tea on the table before taking his seat in the leather chair opposite her without looking directly at her, Claire knew that if she did not speak now, she might lose whatever remained of herself. She stood, stepped into the center of the room, blocking the light between them. Julian looked up, his eyes calm as ever, as though he had learned long ago to hide every truth behind a flawless surface. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, each word carved from stone. Julian nodded, waiting, as though he had anticipated this moment. "I cannot live like this anymore. I am not something to be stored away in a house without sunlight. I am a person. I have a life. I have friends. I have things unfinished out there. You cannot ask me to believe you love me while keeping me locked away in the name of safety." Julian placed the cup down, his hand tightening slightly as he continued watching her. He did not interrupt. Claire stepped closer. "I am not saying I am not afraid. I am afraid of the people watching us, of the parts of your world I do not yet understand, but what I fear more is losing myself before anyone ever touches me." Julian rose slowly, towering half a head above her, his shadow stretching across the wall behind him. Claire did not step back. She met his gaze without flinching. "You cannot love me like this, Julian. You cannot keep me hidden just so you can breathe easier. That is not love, that is control, and I cannot live in control." Julian exhaled, as though he had held the air inside him for far too long. He stepped closer, his voice low and rough. "Do you think this is easy for me? I lost my father at 13 because of one small mistake. My mother lived the rest of her life like a ghost. Everyone around me learned that feelings are a fatal weakness, so I kept everyone away. Until you." Claire felt her throat tighten, but she said nothing. Julian lifted his hand as if to touch her, then let it fall. He studied her as though trying to memorize every line of her face, every flicker in her eyes before letting go. His voice dropped to a whisper. "Then what is it you want?" "I want to live, to choose, to walk out of here. Even if it is dangerous, I will face it. But I will not let myself be kept in a gilded cage, not even for love." Julian closed his eyes, a fleeting ache passing across his face, but when he opened them again, it was gone. He nodded slowly, the gesture carrying the quiet acceptance of someone who knew they were losing something they had no right to hold. Claire turned away and walked toward the door. She had no idea where she would go, nor whether he would truly let her leave. But she knew one thing with absolute clarity, that if she did not stand up today, tomorrow she would no longer recognize herself. And that, more than any unseen threat lurking beyond these walls, was the fear she could not bear to live with. Julian found Claire in the small park beside the old stone church on Dearborn Street, on an afternoon when a thin veil of Chicago fog made everything look like a scene from an old film. She was sitting on a weathered wooden bench, a notebook in her hands, her head resting lightly against the back of the seat, her eyes half closed as if she were hiding in the last quiet corner this city still offered her. Julian did not call out to her. He stood a few steps away, watching with an exhaustion and ache that softened the edges of his expression. When Claire lifted her head, she was not surprised to see him. Perhaps some part of her had already known he would come. She did not run, nor did she speak. Julian approached her slowly, as if each step was a negotiation with himself. Claire met his gaze, her eyes calm, no longer those of a woman easily swayed by gentle words. Julian did not sit. He stood before her, holding a small dark leather box in his hand, without ribbon, without decoration, without any pretense of romance. He opened it, revealing a simple platinum ring, no gemstone, no flourish, shining with a cold, unyielding light that mirrored the silence lingering between them. Claire looked at the ring, then at him. Julian did not kneel or reach for poetry. His voice was low, roughened, frayed at the edges. I do not know how to keep you without hurting you. I am not good with feelings. All I know is that from the moment you stepped into my life, everything changed. Even the thing I fear most no longer makes me turn away the way it once did. Claire's fingers tightened around her notebook, her breath catching. He paused before continuing. If I have you beside me, even if the world collapses, I have somewhere to return to. I cannot promise you absolute safety. I cannot give you a normal world, but I can promise that I will never leave you to face anything alone. Be my wife, Claire, not for any other reason, but because I cannot imagine a life without you in it. Claire rose from the bench, not looking at the ring but at Julian himself, at the flicker of desperation beneath his hardened gaze. Then she shook her head, not because she did not love him, but because the very depth of that love made it impossible for her to accept a proposal born out of fear and the need to hold on. I do not want to be married as a solution, Julian. I want to be loved as a person, not as a piece of your survival plan. Julian faltered, the hand holding the box trembling slightly. Claire stepped back, her voice free of anger or blame, carrying only a quiet sorrow. I am not saying no forever, but I cannot say yes when both of us are still trapped in a storm you yourself cannot see the end of. I need to find myself again. And you, if you truly want to keep me, must let me come back as someone who chooses you, not someone who must love you to stay alive. Julian did not speak. He did not reach for her. He simply stood there, letting her walk away through the thickening evening fog, as though he too were swallowed by the emptiness he had created. And Claire, turning the corner, let her tears fall silently, without a sob, because she knew the choice was right even as her heart shattered piece by fragile piece. Watching her figure disappear into the fog, Julian did not move, but his hand quietly reached for his phone, sending a single command to his shadow team: watch over her. Do not let her out of sight for a single second. Claire moved back into her old apartment on the 6th floor of a red brick building near the river, the place where she had once imagined spending the rest of her life as an ordinary woman with a writing job and a few houseplants that never managed to stay green. On her first day home, everything seemed untouched, as though time had been paused in the thin layer of dust on her desk and the gray wool blanket she used to curl under during cold autumn nights. But within a few days, Claire began to sense that nothing was the same, and perhaps nothing ever would be. She returned to the office, greeted by colleagues with hugs and carefully concealed curiosity. Rachel held her longer than usual, asked nothing at first, then whispered that something about her had changed, not her hair or clothes, but her eyes. Claire smiled without answering, because she knew she was no longer the woman who once laughed out loud at silly lines in a romantic novel. She sat at her familiar desk, opened her laptop, and stared at the manuscript she had started 3 months earlier, only to find the words foreign. The characters who once felt alive now seemed distant, as if she no longer possessed the innocence needed to believe that every love story ended with a sunset kiss. Each night, Claire returned to her apartment, turned on the lights, and sat on the sofa for hours doing nothing. Every time she stepped into the elevator, she glanced at the mirror, trying to guess who had been there before her. Every small sound outside her door made her chest tighten. No more letters arrived, no more photographs appeared, yet the silence itself felt ominous, like a trap waiting to spring. She had once longed to return to her old world, but now she realized she had left it behind forever the moment she kissed the wrong man in a bar. Claire tried to fill the emptiness with old routines: morning coffee at the corner cafe, Wednesday afternoons at the library, brief conversations with the cat-loving elderly neighbor. But none of it felt enough anymore. Something inside her had awakened, shaken loose at the deepest level, making her old life feel too quiet, too small. She wrote more, but not the soft romantic stories she once loved. Her pages were now full of raw emotion, of pain wrapped inside sentences, of longing hidden in dialogue, and in every paragraph, she felt Julian's presence, even though his name never appeared. One night, as she sat by her window watching the city lights shimmer over the dark river, Claire realized she might have lost the ability to live like an ordinary person, not because she wanted to, but because the things she now knew could never be forgotten. She knew the feeling of being watched. She knew what it meant to trust someone enough to place her life in their hands. And she knew what it meant to walk away from love in order to save herself. The old world was still there, unchanged, but she no longer belonged to it. And somewhere inside her, an unnamed hollow reminded her that there was a man somewhere in the shadows who was still watching her as if he had never truly let her go. That evening held no rain, yet the cold felt strangely sharp, slipping beneath the seams of Claire's coat as she walked home after meeting a new author at a small cafe on Wabash. She took the same route she always did, passing rows of bright windows while quietly imagining a cup of hot cocoa and an hour with the unfinished manuscript sitting on her desk. But the moment she turned into the narrow alley behind her building, she heard uneven footsteps echoing behind her. Claire looked back. No one. The alley lay empty, washed in a muted gold glow from the street lamp above. She kept walking, her pace quickening, her heartbeat shifting into something skittish. Then the footsteps grew louder, closer. Without warning, a dark figure lunged from behind a large trash bin, shoving her violently onto the cold pavement, ripping her bag off her shoulder as her head struck the concrete edge with a sharp, stunning pain. In those frantic seconds, Claire heard the stranger's hoarse whisper against her ear, "This is not a robbery. This is a warning." His hand clamped around her throat, cold and merciless, her vision blurring at the edges. Just as the darkness began to press in, a crashing sound exploded behind them, and in the next instant the attacker was ripped away from her and thrown hard against the brick wall across the alley. Claire coughed, desperate for breath, eyes hot with tears. Through the blur, she saw Julian. He said nothing, his face carved from ice, his eyes sharp enough to cut through the darkness. Each of his strikes against the attacker swift, precise, and ruthless. The man screamed, tried to scramble away, but Julian forced him to the ground, pinning him with a strength that allowed no escape as he tore something from the man's jacket. Claire staggered to her feet, trembling, unable to fully comprehend the scene before her. When the struggle ended, Julian turned toward her, no longer the mysterious man in a dark shirt, but the man she had once loved, once walked away from, and who now stood before her as if he had never left. He reached for her, his hands warm and firm, the only anchor she had in that moment. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough, frayed by breath and fear. Claire nodded, tears spilling before she could stop them. "I thought you were gone," she whispered. Julian looked at her, and for a heartbeat his eyes softened even as his voice remained unyielding. "I never left. I respected your freedom, but I never stopped protecting you. My men have been guarding this alley every night." He glanced at the unconscious attacker. "He was a mercenary sent by the remnants of the council, trying to use you as leverage, but it ends tonight." He lowered his forehead to hers, his hands steady on her shoulders as though afraid she might slip away if he loosened his grip. Claire closed her eyes and allowed that familiar warmth to wash over her. She did not know whether this was weakness or instinct, but in his arms for the first time in months, she felt truly protected. When the police arrived and Julian gave a brief statement, Claire sat on the curb, her hand still clasping his. She knew this was far from over. Her attacker had not been a random street thief. He had been sent, with a purpose. And if Julian had not appeared when he did, the outcome could have been far worse. But above all else was the undeniable truth that even after she walked away, Julian had never stopped watching over her, never stopped caring, and never stopped loving her. Claire sat across from Julian in his new apartment, not the towering penthouse of glass walls and sweeping city views he once lived in, but a smaller place inside an old building with a balcony draped in climbing vines. The warm glow from a vintage ceiling lamp cast a gentle amber light across the room, as though Julian too was trying to begin again with something simpler. 2 cups of steaming coffee sat on the table, and between them stretched a silence, not tense but solemn, the kind of silence that signaled they both understood. This was a moment they could not avoid. Claire placed her hand on the wooden surface, tracing the rim of her cup as if grounding herself before she spoke. "I cannot come back if everything stays the same." Julian lifted his head, his eyes still soft, yet shadowed by a quiet weariness that had clearly lived inside him for far too long. She continued, her words carefully chosen but pulsing with emotion. "If you love me, if you truly want me beside you, it cannot be only protection or whispered promises hidden in the dark. I cannot live in a world where every choice is disguised beneath the word safety. I cannot be part of your life if I do not know exactly where I stand." Julian watched her for a long moment before nodding slowly. He stood, walked to the window, and pulled aside the curtain, revealing nothing but the brick wall of the neighboring building, no skyline, no glittering lights, only a dim sky heavy with gray clouds. He turned back, leaning against the frame, his shoulders lowered as if shedding something he had carried for years. "You want the truth? You will have the truth. I no longer work with the people you met at that gallery event. I have severed every tie with the council, dismantled most of the network, keeping only those who are necessary to protect what remains. I do not run anything from the shadows anymore. I am trying to build something ordinary, at least as ordinary as I can manage." Claire listened quietly, her gaze never leaving him. She wanted to believe, but belief required more than words. "Then what are we, Julian? Do we still exist as something, when the darkness is no longer surrounding us?" Julian stepped closer, closing the distance, his hand brushing hers gently, not gripping, not claiming, but asking a silent question. His voice was soft but steady. "I do not know how to love the way others do, but if you give me a chance, I will learn." Claire drew her hand back, not in rejection, but to underscore the weight of what she needed to say. "There is no halfway, Julian. I am not coming back to keep running, hiding, or living as a woman tucked behind a safe door. If we begin again, it has to be built together. Openly, honestly, facing things side by side. If not, then there is nothing." Julian looked at her, and then smiled faintly for the first time in many months. It was not the smile of a man who had won, but of someone who had finally found himself after being lost for far too long. "Then we build, Claire. Brick by brick, day by day. It does not have to be perfect. It only has to be real." Claire nodded, and this time when she laid her hand on his, it carried no hesitation, no trembling, only acceptance. Not a perfect ending, but a new beginning, one where they both understood exactly where they stood and where they would go, together or not at all. But whatever came next, it would be a choice they made themselves, not one made for them. A year later, Chicago slipped gently into autumn, the leaves along the riverfront turning brilliant gold, falling one by one as if time itself had slowed to let people reflect on everything they had lived through. Claire sat by the window of their 4th-floor apartment, her fingers moving steadily across the keyboard of her old laptop, the one that had remained her most loyal companion. In front of her was the nearly finished manuscript with the working title The Wrong Kiss, a fictional novel, though anyone who knew Claire understood it carried more truth than imagination. It told the story of a woman who fell in love with a man who did not belong to her world, and how a single, mistaken kiss unraveled a chain of choices that changed both their lives forever. Claire did not write to justify or excuse. She wrote because she needed to, so the things that once haunted her could be named, told, and released. Julian respected her creative space, never interfering with her writing, even though he knew perfectly well he was its central inspiration. Instead, he brewed coffee, cooked meals, and left her charming little notes like, "Are you writing the kiss scene yet?" or "Please don't kill the main character in the final chapter." Their lives no longer held midnight phone calls from faceless men, no longer required a safe house or guards at the door. Julian had truly changed not only the way he lived but the way he loved. He had learned to share his thoughts, his fears, and the past he once hid like a scar. Claire learned to forgive, not because he deserved absolution, but because her own heart needed the release. They rebuilt everything from the ground up as they had promised, brick by brick, day by day, with all the sincerity they had. That morning, when Claire typed the final sentence and hit save, Julian entered the room carrying 2 cups of coffee. He set one down, glanced at the screen, and asked gently, "You're finished?" Claire nodded, exhaling as though a weight had finally lifted from her chest. Julian said nothing, simply smiled and walked out. But less than 10 minutes later, he returned, not with more coffee but with a cream-colored envelope tied with a red ribbon. Claire opened it to find a printed invitation not for a party or a press event, but for something far more intimate. The embossed words read, "An invitation to a special literary announcement at Jackson Park at 5 o'clock in the evening." She looked up at Julian, stunned and curious. He only offered the same mysterious shrug he had always used to hide something meaningful. At exactly 5, Claire stepped into Jackson Park, where a small stage had been set up, chairs neatly arranged, and white floral wreaths framing the space with a warm, gentle elegance. There were no reporters, no loud music, only familiar faces, a few close friends, and Rachel in the front row, her eyes shining brighter than the golden evening lights. When Claire was invited on stage to speak about her forthcoming book, Julian walked out from behind her, microphone in hand, interrupting the host with a sentence that brought the entire park to silence. "Before Claire speaks, there is something I need to say." Every gaze turned toward him, while Claire froze as he went down on one knee at the center of the stage, holding the same ring she had once refused, but now placed inside a new ivory-colored box, simple and exquisite. Julian looked directly into her eyes, his voice steady but full of emotion. "Claire, you gave me a second chance. You taught me that love is built, not hidden. I am not asking you to marry me to keep you. I am asking because I want to walk with you equally, fully, without ever turning away again. Be my wife, not because you need me, but because we choose each other, today and every day after." Claire stood still. There was no fear this time, no heaviness, only a fullness so tender it nearly stole her breath. She stepped forward, asked no questions, and nodded as tears spilled, but her smile remained. Julian rose, wrapped her in his arms as applause echoed across the park, and for the first time in a very long time, they both knew that this time, everything was real. The garden behind Julian's mother's house in the northern suburbs of Chicago had never been so full of life. The old maple trees rustled in the gentle May breeze, lavender bloomed in soft purple waves along the white wooden fence, and sunlight filtered through the leaves, settling warmly over the rows of wooden chairs arranged neatly beneath an archway of pale paper flowers. Claire stood inside the small upstairs room, once used by Mrs. Moreau as a sewing space, now transformed into a makeshift bridal room. Ever since Julian completely severed ties with the dark world, Mrs. Moreau seemed to have awakened from a long nightmare, her smile returning as if the shadow of the past had finally lifted. In the mirror, Claire wore a simple white dress with light lace skimming her shoulders, her hair gathered low, a few loose strands falling softly against her cheeks, and in her eyes was a peace she had not seen in herself for many years. Standing behind her, Rachel fixed into her hair a delicate silver pin that Julian's mother had given her earlier that morning. A family heirloom passed down through 3 generations of Moreau women, now gifted for the first time to someone who did not bear the Moreau name but carried the heart of the family's son. When the music drifted across the garden, Claire stepped out of the little wooden house with Julian's mother at her side, walking slowly along a path lined with wild daisies and glass candles, while Julian waited at the end, dressed in a soft gray suit, his smile gentle as morning sunlight. His eyes did not leave her for even a moment, as if the entire world had narrowed into that single breath, only her and the quiet rhythm of 2 hearts that had once fallen out of step and now found each other again. The ceremony was brief and intimate. No minister, no elaborate traditional rituals, only friends, family, and 2 people standing face to face, reading the vows they had written themselves. Claire looked into Julian's eyes, her voice trembling slightly yet clear. "I kissed you by mistake in a bar, and everything could have ended right there, but you refused to let it be a mistake. You turned it into a chance, a journey, a new life. I was afraid then, and I left, but I also came back, because I knew that if there was one person I would choose to make a mistake with, it would always be you." Julian tightened his hold on her hands, his gaze bright beneath the sunlight, and he answered in a warm, steady voice that made the entire garden fall silent. "You walked into my life as an accident, but the most beautiful accident I have ever had. Before you, I lived in a world of shadows and control. After you, I learned how to live honestly, love honestly, and let go of every mask. If there is anything I am certain of today, it is this: that mistake led me to the right place, the right person." The garden erupted in applause as they shared their first kiss as husband and wife. It was not loud or showy, just a kiss full of understanding, as if they were signing a new covenant based not on ideals or promises but on the journey they had taken to reach this day. The reception afterward was filled with laughter, soft jazz, and twinkling lights hanging across the garden like miniature stars. Claire and Julian did not dance a waltz or a dramatic tango. They simply held hands and swayed gently on the grass, like two people who had finally found the rhythm meant for them. Near the end of the evening, when most of the guests had gone, Julian pulled Claire close and whispered that he once believed fate was something people invented to excuse the things they could not explain. But you showed me that some mistakes are meant to lead us exactly where we belong, and I know that place is here with you. Claire rested her head on his shoulder, her eyes drifting toward the star-dotted sky. In her heart there were no more questions, no more fears, only gratitude for that single fateful moment, one she once thought was a mistake, but had revealed itself as the only path that could have ever led her to true love. On an early, gentle morning when sunlight was still pale along the eaves and sparrows chattered softly on the branches outside the window, Claire stepped out of the bathroom with her hand resting lightly on her belly. The thin sweater she wore clung softly to her figure, and beneath its fabric grew a small life taking shape day by day. Julian was making coffee in the kitchen. He turned when he heard her footsteps, his gaze lingering on Claire longer than usual, as if he still could not quite believe that this miracle was real. They had never planned for it. No meticulous schedules, no bright red plus sign appearing exactly 3 minutes after a test, prompting cinematic tears of joy. Only quiet nights when Claire placed a hand on her stomach and sensed something inside her had changed. And then one calm afternoon at the clinic, when the doctor smiled and confirmed in a voice gentle as early spring wind that a tiny heart had formed and was beating steadily. Julian had said nothing when he heard the news. He only held Claire tightly and whispered against her ear that if she had not kissed the wrong man that night, he would not have the most precious thing in his life now. He called the child Faith, not as a chosen name, but as a truth he saw in this new life. Faith that a mistake could lead toward what is right. Faith that love, when nurtured with honesty and courage, could bloom into something lasting. Faith that the past does not define us, but the choices we make from this moment forward do. Claire continued to write, but now it was no longer only to heal herself. It was to share stories of hope, of people who seemed lost but found their way to one another in the most unexpected moments. Julian was no longer the man who lived along the edge of shadow and light, but a husband, and soon a father, learning to fold tiny baby clothes with an earnest seriousness, as though preparing for an important meeting. And when he saw Claire smiling in the late afternoon sun, her hand resting on her belly and her eyes filled with a quiet happiness he had never seen before, Julian understood that even if their life had begun with a mistake, it could still arrive at a tender and beautiful ending. Sometimes we do not need to know everything in advance. Sometimes we only need to believe. Claire and Julian's story is a reminder that every mistake carries within it an opportunity. Every fear can be soothed by genuine love, and nothing is ever truly accidental if it leads us to the right place, the right person. Dear friend, if you have listened this far, we believe your heart has stirred along with theirs. How does this story make you feel? Does any part of it reflect something from your own life? Have you ever wondered whether a mistake in your past might have been the doorway to something far more precious than you expected? Please leave a comment below so we can hear the feelings that come from the deepest part of your heart. And if you loved this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like, and share, so more people can discover touching human stories every day. We look forward to seeing you in the next video, where we will continue to bring emotional journeys and meaningful lessons through every tale we tell. Wishing you a peaceful day, a steady spirit, and a heart open to life. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.